Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Indie Game Movement, the podcast that talks about the marketing and business of indie games. I'm Andrew Pappas. I'm going to be your host today, along with Mustapha Price, our show's producer, and this is episode 149, where we're going to be talking about how to find your ideal player. So I can't think of how many times we have discussed or at least mentioned the importance of knowing your audience, but never took the time to really dig deep and explain what exactly that entails or how to really know what is going on in your ideal player's head. So that's why Mustapha and I wanted to dive deep in this conversation to explain the reasoning behind this, what the process entails, and ultimately determine where exactly you can find your ideal player. So that's what we're going to be talking about right here today on Indie Game Movement. Hey, everybody, and we're back, and how's it going? I got Mustapha here with me. Mustapha, how's it going, buddy?
Doing great. Feels good to be back. I feel like I haven't been on one of these since the Supergiant one.
Yeah, it's been a while, so
Yeah.
Long overdue to have one of our own discussions and everything, so yeah, man, I missed you.
Hey, missed you too. Glad to be back at it.
No, it's not like Mustapha and I don't talk in between episodes and stuff either, but it's not the same. It's not the same. All right.
That spring cleaning, it really overtakes you.
Oh, yeah, you're telling
The
me.
weather out here would be convinced otherwise.
Right? I still have so many leftover leaves from October, the fall, and yeah, it's doing a number on me. And it's to say that I need to work out more, do some type of exercise, something. Anyways, we're not here to hear me whine about how sore I am from like things that most people shouldn't be sore from, I guess. But anyways, yeah, so today we're here to talk about how to find your ideal player, because let's face it, there's been so many times on this show that we talk about, know your audience and have empathy and all these other factors. And yes, we do go into some detail within the context of that particular episode, but we never really have gotten to the point, at least I'm pretty sure we haven't, where we do a deep dive to really understand and know like how to find your ideal player. And quite frankly, that's all what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to create communities and get a player base, so when your game gets released that people are actually playing it. That's the goal here. So we wanted to kind of like go into a little bit more here with finding out how, who is your ideal player? How do you find them and things like that? So let's kick it off, Mustapha, and with being like, where do you think are the best places to find your ideal players?
Whew, man, now that right there, loaded question. but I think I have a pretty concise answer, actually. The best place to find your players is at the games that they're playing, right? I mean, I would say generally speaking, especially first-time devs, especially first-time indie devs, it's probably not likely that you're going to be looking to make something that has the broad mass appeal of Madden or Mario Party, right? You're probably creating something a little bit more on the niche side, which means it's likely something inspired by, in some sense, an experience you've had with a game, or providing a solution for a problem or gap in the existing library of games that you're aware of, which means that there's likely already an existing audience for it, already playing other games that are similar to yours. So I would say that's a great place to look. Meet people where they are, so to speak.
Yeah, and one thing I want to pick out of that, what you just said, that's I think is going to really help people find out and answer this question through this discussion we're having today, is you mentioned about solving a problem. So you led in with like, hey, there's big titles or even more like niche titles that are similar to something that our listeners are making today, but you mentioned about having a problem. And I think this is one of the trickiest parts is what is their problem, right? What is the problem that players are having with the games? And I'll be honest with you. This is part of the most frustrating part of the process. At least this and knowing more about really getting into the player's head of who your ideal player is. And so, in terms of the problem, I would love to talk a little bit about that more as well too, because part of what you said too, I feel, is sometimes devs can get like too focused on their game and maybe how it can compare to other games and stuff as that being the primal focal point to determining their audience. Now, obviously, it's still important. We still got to consider those other games that it's like, but to really get more into it, finding out what that problem, or another way of phrasing it is pain point. What is that player pain point? So, what are some ways, Mustapha? I know you're working on your own thing, your own game project, and everything. What are some ways that you guys have gone across in terms of finding out what your potential, player pain point is? And you alluded to it in your last comment too.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll give an example from us, and then I think I have a better example that probably would resonate more with people, probably has some wider reaching application. But on our side, the game that we're making right now is it's a deck builder that is intended to have kind of a somewhat competitive edge to it, but it's also intended to be very party game friendly. So we try to keep the rules simple, try to, create engaging cards with kind of comedic undertones, and leveraging that. I think the pain point that we're kind of striking at is learning curves in card games.
Yep.
A game like Magic is very rewarding to play. Same with stuff like Yu-Gi-Oh, right? But I think as you kind of ease away from the target demo of TCGs or trading card games specifically, it becomes very difficult to become invested without necessarily having the background knowledge to overcome some of those learning curves. And I wouldn't necessarily see that those are a problem with those games at all. I just think it's something that we can create something to remedy that for players who maybe want the fun and experience of strategizing with a card game, but don't necessarily have, say, the time or resources to dedicate to overcoming some of those learning curves. So that's kind of the problem that or pain point that we identified. And the overall aesthetic and approach to our design philosophy is suited specifically to overcoming that. But sometimes you don't even get that part of the process before the game's made. Looking at like over the last year, obviously we've seen the incredible like surgence of the popularity of Among Us, as well as Fall Guys. Like those two games in particular defined a lot of the conversation around video games like over the entirety of 2020. I would say it was those two and Animal Crossing. And Cyberpunk, but so like I would say, like, with that in mind, I mean the problem wasn't necessarily a game design problem or a game accessibility problem at all. It was a societal problem. It was a lack of social gatherings and the inability to engage in social experiences the way that we're used to. And so the games service that need by creating at least a similar experience, supplementing what we were kind of universally lacking just by the way that they were made. So the problem might not even be a game problem. It's kind of like, I would say, one of the most inherent principles of business, right? I mean, whatever it is that you're creating, it has to service a gap, whether that gap is in what games are available or what we as people are in the mood for or craving. I think very rarely you find something like loneliness or isolation to be so universal. So I think it might be difficult to have that broad of an appeal while aiming to appease that pain point. But there are probably still smaller things that you could pick up on and grab a much larger audience by servicing.
Yeah, and I want to say that I think that was a great example from a broad perspective too, because I think what that showcases is basically the breadth of like the various pain points, right? And I'll give a couple examples too, because it's like one, you were talking about yourself and you're like, okay, there could be there's potential learning curves when it comes to some card games and stuff. And we want to part of our take is addressing that. And then with the pandemic and people not being socially, there's another pain point that's addressed that originally wasn't even probably really number one intention of those games. It wasn't like they were purposely trying to solve that, but by naturally they did, right? So in other areas in terms of addressing pain points too, it could be something as looking at yourself and you as the game maker, the developer, and finding out what is the main reason you're making the game, right? And I would say most likely and most chances are you're making it out of your own pain point. And if you look at any like up and rising entrepreneurial product or service that's out there, like just about in any other industry, a lot of the times people will make things out of their own pain points. Man, there's like so many random ideas coming through my head on what people have done, but like the main thing I would say is, why are you making your game? What's one of the main reasons? Let's say you really wanted a particular game made that you thought there was other great titles that you loved growing up with, but they didn't necessarily address that one mechanic or aspect or whatever that you really wanted to see in it, and no one else is doing it, and you're like, I just really want to make this game like this because I think it would just be great and I would have fun with it, and I'm sure other people would. Whatever your reasoning behind that is, chances are, and Mustapha mentioned this too, that there's others out there that share that, right? So I would say look at what at the heart and the core of your game is. I mean, yeah, there are going to be mechanics and stuff. I wouldn't focus too much on the mechanics. The mechanics are kind of the mechanism to address the pain point, though, right? Potentially, and then there's other elements too. But look at that aspect and elements of it, and find out what is the pain point. Why are you making that game? What's part of the reason for it? And I really hope it's not just for money, because I think we all know by now that that can be a really hard pill to swallow after you start doing it after a while.
Yeah. There are probably much faster ways if that's what you're looking for.
Right. And guess what? If you say to people like, I'm making this game for money, or if it comes off that way, like, do you think like your potential audience or the players care? Because that's not their pain point. You're not addressing their pain point or anything about them at that matter. And as I think we know well enough, it's not all about you. It's about your players and stuff. But a little bit's about you, right? Because you're putting your heart and soul into these projects. So it makes sense. But not making that the absolute focal point. Because I think and keep going.
You called back to something that really made me think. It Takes Two, the game that like just came out. It's like, I can't remember his last name. I know his first name's Yosef. He is very famous for cursing out the Oscars at the Game Awards. He had an interview recently where he was discussing that like he believes that It Takes Two and its like kind of breakout success is indicative of the fact that players really do want more co-op games and feel that there simply aren't enough of them. And like, that's another kind of benefit to leveraging the pain point as a principle of design, is that it empowers you through success to validate your claim. And I think through that, you have the ability to kind of influence the directions of the industry. And we've seen that in a number of ways over the last several years.
Yeah, no, definitely. And as we kind of close up this discussion, move on to the next one too, I do want to call out that, like, for anybody who, let's say, still having difficulty or struggling trying to determine, I don't get it, what the player pain point would be. I know I'm just making this game because it's entertaining and people like that. Well, some other really basic strategies that anybody can use, and they're free, is I know this is but it's just like Googling what potential problems are. Like, again, going back to what you're thinking about, like, what's the reason you're creating the game, right? And then, or also, like, maybe look up, like, what are the problems people have with this game, right? You'll probably see a lot of Reddit results, and Reddit's actually a great place to ask questions and get people's honest, like, answers. Like, that's actually one of the methods I do to really further understand things and how people feel about certain things. It's a process. I'm not gonna lie, but just like finding out, like, and sometimes when you're searching for things on Google, especially if you're phrasing a certain question, what's going to pop up is a drop down menu and all other inquiries that are popping up. I can't think of it. Answer the Public, I think, is another site, which you could do some like basic keyword research around games and stuff. I've experienced that it's not as helpful in terms of the types of the results that I get, the number of results, I should say, but that takes any and all queries in different forms of questions too, where you can start getting a better sense of what people are actually searching for. And what's really good about this is it shows their intent and everything else. And if they have like intent that's very pain point specific, it gives you even more insight. And what's really cool about doing things this way, and even using Reddit as well to ask these types of questions to see what people feel, you can start picking up on those commonalities. And then it's giving you more ideas, but not just ideas, it's allowing you to get better into the player's head. So, or your ideal player. So that's what we're gonna focus at and talking about more. And one last thing I want to say before we go into the next topic is simply, what is your player's core value? Like, if you were to boil it down to like 3 things, and I'm getting this from Richard Branson's teachings, because he's a really good guy about this type of stuff too. If you ever want to follow him, pick up any of his books, great stuff. Core values come down to like 3 things: health, wealth, and relationships. Well, guess what, guys? We fall all the games, I would say, unless for whatever reason they don't fall into the relationship game. So understanding that what you're doing is you're setting basically the core foundation to establishing a relationship. And it's very applicable too, because what do we talk about here on the show a lot of the times and everything else? Having empathy for people, having a community, and then really catering to that community. So again, being relationship driven and then finding out what their pain points are. If you're addressing a pain point, you are in the process of basically, at least as games are, creating that relationship with them. So I know it's not necessarily a tangible aspect thing, but again, it's having this understanding, because what we're trying to accomplish here in this episode specifically is so you guys can go out there and really understand getting into your ideal player's head. So let's move on. Let's now discuss some other very important information, which is, demographics, interests, and behaviors, and how do we really fully understand those things. So let's just say that, determining, the demographics is another great way to help narrow down your audience. So Mustapha, what are some of the things that you guys have done in terms of identifying what your ideal player base demographics are?
Sure, yeah. I mean, we've discussed a number of things, especially given the nature of the scene that we're kind of going into. Age is a big one. We realize that realistically, we are still selling something for revenue, or at least that's the goal. So adults are typically our target demo, because, we
Yep.
want people who are able to leverage their own income. Then I would say comp titles is typically something that we look at. What are games that are similar to the ones that we make, and who is playing those games? Again, the nature of our pain point kind of dictates that we are also targeting people on the outskirts of the collectible card game genre. So people who might be more casually interested in those types of games. Probably, I would say, more Hearthstone players than Magic players, for instance. People who kind of like the simplicity and burst-like nature of that game, I think would probably translate well to our ideal player base. And then I would say social behaviors. Are these the types of people who would go out and have a game night, or are these the type of people who are going to ragers? Like, these are the types of things that we're kind of identifying the difference between. Because don't get me wrong, like I think our game would do great in a club/bar setting, but I don't know that everyone would agree. So, stuff like that, it kind of helps us to narrow our focus. And it kind of informs how we go about designing cards and mechanics.
Yeah, no, some great points there, and one that you brought up that I wanted to call out on, just because I know some, I feel that some developers will do immediately when they're thinking about, oh, who is in my core audience. Oh, it's specifically people who play this game and this game and this game, right? And then and it's not to say again that those aren't bad ways to address things, but it's more of, I think they look at that and then they just stop. Right, so it's like, oh, I'm only going to focus on people who play this type of game. Well, and the reality is, though, like there's more to people than just the games that they play, especially if it's only 3 that are so close to yours. Because chances are that if we're thinking of this ideal player, they didn't just play those 3 games and then called it, and now they're thinking about your game, right? It doesn't work that way. They could very well be like, because I think what happens is they just, some devs will just focus on a specific genre and think that's it. That's my audience. They play this game or whatever. But I mean, how many of you always play? And I'm sure there's maybe a select few, but how many of you just play within one genre, nothing but? I mean, I think that's extremely uncommon. Yes, and plus obviously there's going to be some overlaps with genres and things like that. But basically what I'm saying here is going in with that mindset is going to be very limiting and narrowing, and it doesn't necessarily help you really work or do a good job at finding who your ideal audience. And that's what we're really here talking about, is who is the ideal person. And those people consist up of a lot of different things. So that's the only caveat I want to say to that sometimes, is with some people, they just think in that narrow mindset of, within the genre, these 3 titles, we're good. We're just going to target those games.
So here's what I would say to that as kind of my contribution to that point is, so for instance, with the example I gave, someone playing Hearthstone probably doesn't even mean that they would like my game. They might just want to keep playing Hearthstone. So like the thing to consider is that, and in my eyes, from my, I guess, writing background, where comp titles are pretty heavily used in publishing, I would say the advantage to them isn't necessarily that people like this game, so they'll like this game. It's that you can investigate why people like the game you're comparing to. So, like, the example I gave was that people enjoy the fast pacing and simplicity of Hearthstone's design.
Yes. Taking
those things, and then rather than in your Steam description saying, our game's like Hearthstone, because it's not, saying something like, our game employs quick, easy to learn mechanics, that are able to be picked up and played in a short-ish time span. Pick up on why people are playing the games that they're playing. And that's the overlap that you really need to be looking for. It's not even necessarily about matching genres, It's about calling out to what people love, and I think we got a lot of that in our conversation with Chevy back in February. I think, like Eichenfeld is not a game that people love because it's an RPG. It's a game people like because it calls out to the things that people specifically enjoyed about Mega Man Battle Network or Paper Mario, where you're always active while you're moving around in the battles and details like that. So definitely, if you're going to utilize comp titles as an idea, make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. You're not just trying to capitalize on the existing audience of a game that's worked hard to earn it. You're trying to get to the bottom of what people like about those things, and what you and equally important, what people don't like about those things that you do differently.
Yeah, and I want to. Yeah, I just want to elaborate a little bit further on that too, because I think you're even like just kind of going this direction too, not just some of the other similarities and stuff, but even some of the thematics or the themes that those games incorporate too. Because think about it, how many times have you seen or whatever, or people talking about within the industry that like, um, man, there's certain cultures or groups that are definitely underrepresented or poorly represented in video games too. So like anything thematically wise too, and those things could have overlap with not just other games but other things too, such as like TV shows, movies, art. Like now it just really expanding in terms of other ideas that you can get. Again, bringing it back down to your ideal player base, because if you just again look at just the simple aspect of a genre or whatever and not really think outside of the box and where these overlaps are occurring. Because, I mean, let's face it, everybody, especially now more than ever, is consuming all sorts and different types of media. And now it's a pretty interesting time actually, because there's probably a lot more people are even more interested in getting excited about. So tapping into those other things and better understanding where those other overlaps occur, again, is all these elements are going to help you narrow down who is your ideal player. And then just to take it one step further, because what we're doing by talking about these demographics, interests, and behaviors is narrowing things down, right? So everything that we talked about so far, when we're talking about comp titles, just basically other interests, and the demographics, and then also what we'll go into in a moment, behaviors, we are just further narrowing it down. And when you write down these sections of what are their interests, what are their demographics, what are their behaviors, just list them out, kind of like some of the examples we provided before. And just to quickly go over behaviors, like what is a typical user behavior, right? Or your player behavior? Do they spend most or if not all their time on Steam? Do they support crowdfunding? Are they actively on social media all the time? Like, what is their behavior? You could go as deep as like, what type of like material do they regularly read? What type of TV shows do they watch? Do they like Marvel? Do they, any number of things? Just start listing those out and find those commonalities. And what can start to happen once you get them down, again, you start getting more into your player's head. What does that ideal player do? Basically, all what we're talking about is creating a buyer persona, right? Or a player persona. That's all what we're doing through the narrowing of everything. And that's the process of how to develop a persona, because, again, this is one of the most difficult processes that everyone's going to face. And if you don't invest the time and energy into doing it, what can happen is you kind of miss the mark. You want to like be in front of certain specific people, but if you don't do all the legwork up front, you might find out that like, oh, for whatever reason, no one's really liking this as much as I thought they would, or you're not getting the feedback you anticipated, or whatever the problem that's coming up. It could be because you didn't clearly define everything from the beginning, and then when you're getting subpar information or feedback or whatever the case may be, it could be because you're just not right in front of the right people. And that is really hard to go back from. I think actually, if I remember, because this has been a while, is like episode 2 with Bill Gardner. He mentioned that being one of the most difficult things was like testing and trying different audiences and then finding out how to like retweak messaging and all these other things to make sure he's getting in front of the right one. And that's going to be an iterating process anyways, but still, that's what we're trying to avoid.
We had a really good section on market study the first time that we had Tanya on the show, way back. Yeah. And she was talking about specifically for Boyfriend Dungeon and kind of their testing process around, pinning down the audience for that game. And, in clinical terms, of course, the language is like, doing market research and things like that, but I don't think it's necessarily as intimidating or necessarily has as much of a sort of barrier to entry. Like, you could just go around and start asking people on social media, in person, text a friend, be like, hey, what do you play? How long have you been playing it? How long do you usually play games? Small details like that, they help you to get an idea of, retention and how important that's going to be to you, like all sorts of things. And it's all important, but you also don't have to have it all at once. Like Andrew said, it's an iterative process. It takes time. You have to do it a bunch before you even get it down right the first time, right?
Yeah, because it is a lot of guesswork. I mean, just because we're doing research, we're checking out other titles, we're seeing how people react, we're seeing what questions people ask and stuff. It's still guesswork. But at least we're using these tools to give us a better insight in terms of, okay, at least it's guesswork, but I feel a lot more confident about this than just having an initial idea and then running with it. Because we don't want that either. We want results to dictate our actions is basically what it comes down to. And so let's move forward as we start to wrap up here about design and messaging choices, right? And the reason why I want to incorporate this too, because once you get these, we have all this narrowing information about our ideal player. Now we want to even narrow it down. So just some quick comments I'll make about design. If you narrow down that, let's say your core ideal audience player, absolutely. I'll use this example because it's so prominent right now, especially with wholesome games. But let's say your ideal player loves Miyazaki. Well, you might, if your artwork doesn't necessarily represent the tonality or other elements that Miyazaki or Studio Ghibli artwork showcases, then that might not be the best choice in artwork, right? Because you want to really resonate with that core audience. Now, on the flip side, and I don't have any exact examples for this, there could be instances, and this is why, get into your player's head and you'll be able to determine this, but there could be instances where a stark contrast of the style of art could be really beneficial and work for you quite a bit. But still, you need to be the person to decide that, to see if that would be a good move or not. But I would say more often than not, if you know your core base is dedicated to a specific theme or style or whatever, then you want to cater to that. But you don't also want to just outright copy that other style too, right? Because, I mean, let's think of it. A great example too is Breath of the Wild, Zelda. There are a lot of elements in there in terms of the artwork, the type of the color palette, all these other things that are used in that game that, to me at least, scream out Miyazaki, right? And they probably knew that, had great intention. I haven't read anything about it or done research. It's just off the top of my head here. But you can kind of get a good gist and idea of that. And then next, outside of so keep that in mind with your design. If it doesn't align with your player persona and everything we just listed out, then you might want to consider really making sure that your artwork, and when I say artwork, it's important that it's in game too, but even your promotional materials, your capsule art on Steam, your banners, anything that you're using on that front, make sure they're at least in line with what your audience would like. And don't copy things outright, because then it's not going to stand out as well. And then last but not least is messaging choices. The key thing that I can always offer with messaging, and I know, Mustapha, your example with some messaging earlier was just right off the top of your head, but it supports my point here, is making sure that it's just clear and concise, clearly stated. One thing that I find that doesn't work really well and doesn't resonate with people, if you're trying to make a claim. So the easiest way is the best game in the world. Do you really have that claim? I don't think anybody does, unless there's been some huge study out there that said officially.
We'll see. Ours isn't out yet, so but
right.
We'll see.
But avoid making claims like, no, that's an extreme example, the best game in the world. But but if there's something that you're trying to claim, make a basic. I'm trying to think of a better example here. But if you're trying to make a claim where you're ultimately saying something that's deciding for the player, they'll probably call you out on it. And this is how they call you out on it. They don't wish list your game, or they don't take action, basically. Or if you're making a post in Reddit, for example, someone will be like, really? How? Like, you know, or they'll to you, it might sound like they're being a troll about it, but they're even if they are, they're asking a legitimate question. So what I find the best way for
they'll post the game that does the thing you're claiming better.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So ultimately what you're best doing is just say what the game is. Like, it's a game that it's this type of game or whatever. If you want a classic example, go to I wish I wrote it down ahead of time. Go to Hades Steam page, by Supergiant, and look at the first sentence of their description of Hades. They could not make it any more clear and concise. Don't ignore the last part, because all they say, the creators of, and they list all the other titles, because that's irrelevant, really, for our purposes here. Just look at the first sentence, and you'll see that it's, I would say, sure, there's other great examples out there. That's probably one of the best ones I've seen. So, messaging, make it clear and concise.
Absolutely wild, because Hades is like 4 different genres. So, yeah, for them to be able to pull that off is impressive.
It's amazing.
And that's another thing, you really got to know what you're making.
Yeah. All right. Now, to wrap this up, we talked about a lot of different things here, right? And this is where we take it back to our kickoff question: is where are the best places to find your players? Now, this is what we're going to do first. So we're going to go through everything real quick, what we discussed. How to find your ideal player, right? We address pain points, right? And then we narrowed things down further by discussing our demographics, interests, and behaviors. So by the end of this episode, what I'm hoping everybody's going to do is write these things out. Write out your ideal player interests. Write out their potential behaviors. Basic demographics, age, probably the most important one out there, but other factors too, like are they married? Like, do they have do your players have families? Where they live, that type of stuff. But age is probably the most. And then, so we have all this information that's narrowing things down. Now what we want to do is just start listing out places you think that they'll be online. I'm focusing online because, well, current state of things is, well, we're pretty much still very online heavy these days. But even if we weren't, online would probably take precedence, because it's like, let's face it, we're small dev teams, we're solo devs. I mean, getting out and about can be a challenge too, even just going to events, if we had no issues going to events, right? So list out every place that you think people could go to. So I made a quick short list: Reddit, Imgur, podcast, TikTok, YouTube, Instagram. There's tons more, all right? I want you to list everything that you can possibly think of. And then from there, start doing this. Do you think if your demographic, so your age group of your ideal player, let's say they're in their 30s, right? Do you think they're going to be on TikTok? They could be. They might not be. Or how about Snapchat, for example, right? So what this does is, now that you have this list, this narrowing down list of your ideal player, it then starts to eliminate certain areas. Now, you could be wrong, and that's okay. When you get to like really promoting and putting yourself out there more, narrowing down those ideal, because some places people might be, but you don't get the results that you would in terms of engagement or whatever that you would from a different platform. But that's a process that you want to start doing. So list these things out and really think, would my ideal player hang out on TikTok? Because the reason why I say TikTok as an example, it's obviously the platform's blowing up, and a lot of people are finding some good success with promoting their games on there. But again, like Mustafa's point earlier, he's like, well, our demographic is they're in their 30s or they're adults, because there's a good chance or likelihood that people who are younger, like young adults, might not have expendable incomes in which they can have no problem spend money on games, right? Maybe they do. Again, that can go into behavior. There's other factors there, but he made a good point. That's why his target audience, at least for age demographics, is in their 30s. They have more money available to spend on things like that. So if a younger audience is on TikTok and they're less likely to have the money to spend on your game, maybe that might not be a good alternative. Maybe it is. There's lots of other things to do. But that's what I want people to do, is to list out all the potential places, and then now that you have a little bit more information about your ideal player, start checking them off in terms of that. And then let's say you have a list of 5, narrow it down to 3, because we don't want, or at least 2, or juice even 1. We don't want you to overwhelm yourself. All right, sorry, I threw a lot out there to everybody. Mustapha, do you have any other insight on those fronts in terms of narrowing down the interest and all that other information about your player persona, and then how to then find where they hang out based off of that?
I think you mostly summed up everything I had to say. The only thing I would add is that, like, I wanted to put a quick addendum because, of course, when referring to young audiences, I don't want to imply that I was saying those are worth writing off entirely.
Oh, no, definitely not.
Obviously, like a lot of kids, their parents buy games for. I mean, Fortnite's doing numbers. I don't think that's all adults.
Right.
So very clearly, like, it depends. I was saying mostly because the type of game we're making, I think, is just better suited to probably a millennial aged audience. People who would go to, say, I'm thinking like Boards and Brews, which is a local spot where they have like drinks and board games and card games and stuff like that. Like that type of location, or like a game store, for a game night, like that kind of thing. So just to clarify that, because of course, I'd say with like Nintendo being one of the companies that makes some of the best selling games in the world, like obviously there's a pretty large demographic for young people in games too. So just wanted to clarify that.
No, I think it's a good clarification too, because you should never fully write off anybody. Because what happens is you start forming these ideas that, like, oh yeah, no one would do that. But unless you have like, it's a good process or mindset to kind of go in that way. But don't let that mindset keep you from having an open mind either. Because yeah, to your point, Mustapha, like you don't necessarily want to write anybody off. And then through trial, error, and iterations of this process, you'll start to find out, hey, what channels, what things are going to work best for you in terms of, finding that right audience and where they hang out. Because that's always important, because, again, it goes into everything we're talking about. Really honing it down, narrowing it down, and getting people that are your ideal player base. Because once you start finding them and stuff, and it's, again, not easy, but once you start finding them, it's going to make your process a little bit easier. We can't say it's going to make it easy, because we know for a fact nothing's ever easy, right? Especially anything that's worth making. So, all right, cool. Mustapha, anything else? I think I feel pretty confident that we covered everything in terms of how to find your ideal player and what steps to go through that process. Anything on your end, bud?
No, I'm right there with you, doing well.
All right.
And all with everything we've gone over.
Sweet. Well, again, can't thank you guys enough for joining us today. So thank you. Hey, everyone, and thank you for listening to another episode of Indie Game Movement. I'm Andrew Pappas, your host, and the show's producer is Mustapha Price. A special thanks to Taisuke Kimura for creating the show's theme and Donnie Wilson for the logo design. If you enjoy and value the content, you can support us by visiting our Patreon, which is patreon.com/IGM podcast, and select the tier that meets your needs. Show notes for this episode can be found by visiting rengenmarketing.com/the number of this episode. Rengen Marketing is a consulting marketing company that helps indie devs with their marketing efforts. So if you're looking for helpful marketing content or marketing plan template for your current game, then please visit rengenmarketing.com. And as always, thanks for being such great listeners, and we'll see you next time on Indie Game Movement.